Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled The New West. By the New West, we mean the Trans-Mississippi West after the Civil War. Like the New South, this New West was one of the three regions of the United States that began to unify into a single identifiable nation in the late 19th and into the 20th centuries. There had always been a lure of the frontier for Americans, and the U.S. as a nation had always moved to the west. The Trans-Mississippi West, therefore, was not the first American West. Part of the American Revolution came because colonials wanted to move beyond the Alleghenies and Appalachians. Then, in about 1814 and 1815, with the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the Creek Wars in the American South, Alabama fever lured thousands to the cotton kingdom of what was later called the Old Southwest. There was always an ideology associated with Western expansion, but it became more pronounced during the last half of the 19th century as the German philosophy called Romanticism became rooted in the way Americans thought about themselves. One aspect of this romantic ideology saw the West as a place where free individuals stood against civilization. This idea was popularized by dime novels that featured heroes like Jesse James and Buffalo Bill, many of which were written by Ned Buntline. Another thing that popularized this ideal was the Buffalo Bill Cody Wild West shows. Another ideology, another aspect of Romanticism saw the West as an Eden where humans spoiled by over-civilization could get, what you might say, back to the garden. This was promoted by the paintings of Frederick Remington, and Theodore Roosevelt himself spoke of his own experiences on the frontier as a tonic to revive his manliness. A third aspect was the West as a morality play in which good triumphed over evil. These strands merged under Theodore Roosevelt and led to the environmental conservation movement. Now, this lecture discusses three topics: settling the New West by the United States, the growth of big business in the New West, and how this New West was governed. Let's look now at settling the frontier West. This begins with an understanding of the area's geography. Traveling from east to west, we encounter the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Intermountain High Plains, the Cascade and Sierra Mountains, and moving south, the Great Desert of the Southwest. We also have to understand that the West was already settled by Native Americans, but as the United States had shown in the Mississippi East, their rights simply didn't matter. Once white settlement pressure mounted, a series of Indian wars erupted. The U.S. had been encroaching into the West since Oregon fever of the 1840s and the California gold rush of 1850. To control the potential violence of encounters, the United States tried various ways to corral the Native Americans. One attempt was the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie that allowed whites easement through Indian territories to the Oregon coast. Then, beginning in 1867, Congress carved out large areas of the West for Native American reservations, and in 1869, Congress created the Board of Indian Commissioners. By 1868, however, there was a war on three fronts, the ultimate outcome of which pushed Native Americans into small reservations of undesirable lands, as well as the slaughter of the huge buffalo herds that fed northern tribes. These ended with the defeat of the Native Americans in 1886. Once on the reservations, Indians were subjected to fraud and abuse, as well as a concerted campaign to anglicize them and their cultures. One of the most devastating depredations began, oddly, as a charitable and well-meaning law designed to stop abuse by land swindlers. This was the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. The Dawes Act treated Indians as individuals, not as members of tribes. It introduced the Anglo concept of private property and of self-interested decision-making over common resources. It broke up the reservations by giving each head of the family 160 acres of land. Each adult or orphan over 18 was given 80 acres of land, and everyone under 18 was given 40 acres of land. Each person had 4 years to pick out their land and to live on it as individuals or families. And if they did so, they were granted U.S. citizenship, and their land was held in trust by the U.S. government for 25 years, meaning land speculators couldn't pressure them to sell. That was the theory, at least. Generally, there were more acres of land than what could be parceled among the members of the tribe. And any land that was left over was considered surplus, as was any land that was not claimed within the 4 years. It was open for sale, and much of it was snapped up by white speculators. How badly did the Dawes Act reduce the holdings of the reservations? The amount of land in Indian hands fell from 150 million acres in 1887 to 78 million acres by 1900. Of course, the Dawes Act was amended multiple times, some of which were to make it more equitable for the Native Americans, but the die had been cast. The final resistance, particularly among the Sioux and their allies, to this corralling on the reservations, erupted in the 1889-1890 Ghost Dance movement. The Ghost Dance was begun by Wovoka, shown here as Jack Wilson, who was a northern Paiute and a prophet to the Sioux, who had a vision in 1889 that dancing the Ghost Dance would unite dead ancestors with living Native Americans who would then be able to drive white colonists out of the land. The movement spread among the Sioux after the government cut rations in half when the Sioux's crops failed. Now, the Bureau of Indian Management blamed lazy Indians, quote unquote, for the crop failure, but now we attribute these crop failures to a period of extreme heat and low rainfall. The Sioux's reaction was to continue ghost dancing, which led to a suppression by Americans and American troops. In one incident, Sitting Bull was arrested as one of the leading troublemakers. He was pointed out by an Indian agent who had a private and personal beef with him. As one of the troublemakers, he was arrested, and during the arrest, a shootout occurred in which Sitting Bull was killed. This was in early 1890. And the final act in what the U.S. considered a troublemaking uprising was the Wounded Knee Massacre in late December 1890 that left what we believe is 153 Sioux dead, many of whom were women and children. We can't know the number exactly, but the U.S. Army picked up 153 bodies the following day. Also, it's possible that as many as 25 U.S. soldiers were killed by friendly fire. The upstart of the Wounded Knee Massacre was that, as bad as Indian-American relations had been, they were completely poisoned by the Wounded Knee Massacre. And it has taken a long time to even begin getting beyond that. Let's talk about the settlement of the West. It not only depended on opening up lands by removing those lands from Native American control, but also by modernizing the transportation system beyond the overly slow wagon train. Here, railroads were the answer. The Transcontinental Railroad opened in 1869, and Congress supported railroad expansion by giving millions of acres of land to facilitate and finance operations. Also, the great east to west trunk lines opened in the 1870s. This map shows the extent of land given to the Union Pacific line in Nebraska. The line follows the Platte River in its winding course, and you can see the green so-called 20-mile limit that on either side of the track was given to the Union Pacific Railroad as a land grant in order to facilitate the creation of that railroad and the financing of that railroad through land sales and bonds based on the land. Here's another map that shows in red the amount of railroad construction that took place between 1870 and 1890. And you can see the major trunk lines, two in the northern states of the West, one or two in the central area of the West, and then a couple in the southern area of the West were finished by 1890. Settlers were attracted by opportunity and recruited by boosterism. The ideal was the family of yeoman farmers. This ideal was promoted by the Homestead Act of 1862 that gave families either free or at very reduced prices 160-acre plots throughout the United States, but mostly in the West. Furthermore, railroads resold their land grants for funds. New tools allowed the prairies to be farmed, such as the steel plow, the McCormick reaper, and barbed wire, and new crops were developed for hardiness. Two of these were new types of feed corn and number one, hard wheat, which came from the Russian steppes and creates the type of wheat we use today. The reality of life in the West was difficult. Poverty was rampant, persistent rates were low, especially in arid places. Congress acted to increase persistence, yet their acts tended to aid big business and speculators rather than yeoman farmers. For example, the Timber Culture Act of 1873 allowed for timber to be planted and for extra acreage to be provided for those who planted timber, but in a cash-poor economy, no one could afford to plant the trees required except speculators who could borrow. The Desert Land Act also provided large amounts of land to supplement the 160 acres of the Homestead Act in those areas that were quite arid, but even then they were difficult to farm, and so that tended to aid mining companies. Then the Timber and Stone Act of 1878 did pretty much the same thing. It provided more land for those who were either mining or timbering their lands, and that kind of capital intensity could only come through larger business. Let's talk about that big business in the West now. One thing to remember about the economy of the New West was that it was particularly prone to booms and busts. So let's look at some of the particular kinds of economic activities of big business in the West. The first is mining. There was a change in the type of mining from single prospectors and small labor-intensive groups to capital-intensive big business hard rock mining. That is, a prospector with a pan or a number of prospectors with a sluice operation were replaced by deep drilling that required a lot of upfront capital investment and the hiring of technical experts in underground mining. Boom towns arose at mine sites, and many of these prospectors either left the business entirely or learned some of the skills necessary to get down into these new mines. Another type of business activity that was large in the West was cattle ranching. The big cattle drives that formed the basis of much of what we today think about the Old West only lasted for 20 years, from about 1865 to about 1885. Cattle ranching could provide quick money, but it was easily ruined by weather, financial markets, and changing government policies. That quintessential American icon, the cowboy, was often a young man, frequently black or Mexican, who did hazardous work for abysmally low pay. Rail expansion brought the rail cars to the cattle, thus wrecking the drovers' industry. Let's look at this map of cattle trails and railroad expansion at the height of the cattle driving era. Another big change from small yeoman farming to big business occurred in the West at what was called Bonanza Farms. This was agribusiness that began in 1873 and peaked out a little bit before 1890. It began in 1873 when the Northern Pacific Railroad failed in that year, and investors were allowed to buy the land cheaply as the railroad liquidated. This land was in Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana. And what many of these investors did was to organize their lands that they had bought very cheaply into, say, 10,000-acre agricultural factories run on factory lines. And they were planted in wheat monocultures of this new #1 hard wheat. This spawned an industry of wheat milling in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and in other areas of the great old Northwest. Our last topic in this lecture concerns governing the West. Admission of new states was guided by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that had applied to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and then further on as new states were admitted to the Union. Areas first applied for territorial status to Congress. If they received territorial status, they were garrisoned by the military with a governor appointed by Congress. Upon reaching approximately 60,000 people, the territory applied for statehood. Upon admission as a state, Congress set the political boundaries of the state and allowed the state to hold a constitutional convention. Congress then approved the state constitution and seated its voting members of the House of Representatives and its senators. Now, the land of the state was also surveyed per the Land Ordinance of 1785. And this shows how the Land Ordinance worked. We're looking here at the so-called Western Reserve of the state of Ohio. Now, it's in the east of Ohio, but it was the reserved lands of Connecticut, reserved in this new Northwest Territory for Connecticut, that then became part of the state of Ohio when Connecticut ceded it to the state when Ohio became a state. But look at how this land survey operates, and don't worry too much about how the Western Reserve got its name. It was surveyed into ranges and townships of 6 miles by 6 miles for a total of 36 square miles. Each of these townships, so-called townships, was divided into sections of 1 square mile, or 640 acres, half sections, quarter sections, that's 160 acres, and then divided even further into half quarters and quarter quarters. The quarter is the 40-acre plot. Now, 14 states from the Trans-Mississippi West were admitted to the Union between 1861 and 1912. Kansas was admitted in 1861, just after the Southern delegates all withdrew from Congress. Nevada came in 1864, in large part because the Lincoln administration was afraid that it might lose the election of 1864. Nebraska came in 1867, Colorado in 1876, and then there was a hiatus of about 13 years because the Democrats and Republicans each controlled an equal number of representatives in the House. But then when there was a Republican sweep in the election of 1888, new states were admitted in 1889, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. In 1890, Wyoming and Idaho were admitted. 1896, Utah was admitted. 1907, Oklahoma was admitted. And the last two states to be admitted to the Union in the continental United States were Arizona and New Mexico in 1912. Now take a minute and ask yourself, what were the newest states admitted to the Union? And when did they become admitted? I'll leave you to figure that out for yourself. This then ends the lecture, and as always, thank you for your attention.